In this video, I want to discuss my typical baseline speeds that I use when I'm doing portrait photography. When I typically shoot portraits, I'm shooting handheld. I'm not using a tripod. So if it's weddings or family photography, headshots, I'm going to be holding that camera. Because of that, I kind of have a baseline speed that I always start off with. And that baseline speed really depends on the focal length of the lens that I'm using. Here I have a Canon 60D and I have a 50mm 1.4 on this camera. So the focal length is 50 millimeters. Now there's a rule of thumb out there that kind of gives you a baseline speed based off the focal length of the lens that you're using. And for this lens, being that it's 50 millimeters, the baseline speed would be 1/50th of a second. However, there are certain conditions that you might not want to use that particular speed with this lens. For me, if I shoot anything under 1/25th of a second, that photo is more than likely going to be out of focus because I have a natural tendency to shake a little bit. I can't stabilize the camera by hand as well as, let's say, my wife. My wife can shoot slower than I can because she's able to hold the camera more steady. And it gets even worse if I've had coffee. So keep that in mind. So being the fact that my baseline is 1/25th of a second, the rule wouldn't apply for the 50 millimeter. I would start with 1/25th of a second, and that is my overall baseline speed. Now, let's say you're using a 200 millimeter lens. If you were to use that rule of thumb, then your baseline speed would be 1/200th of a second. Now, if that lens does not have image stabilization, and I were using that lens, if I was shooting at 1/200th of a second, once again, my photos are going to be blurry. So for me, with that rule of thumb, I normally double it. So if I'm using a lens of a focal length of 200 millimeters, I'm going to be shooting at 1/400th of a second because the rule of thumb would be 1/200th of a second. I double it, that would be 1/400th of a second. Now, a lot of Canon's lenses have internal stabilization. The lower end lenses, the stabilization I don't find works as well as, let's say, their L series lenses. If I was using a 70-200 zoom lens, and it is the version that has the internal stabilization, I could shoot handheld with the focal length being 200 and the image would be in focus because of the image stabilization. It helps that much to be able to keep the camera, that image stabilized. So you have to keep that in mind depending on what lens you're using. In this series of videos, the lens I am recommending to start off with for portraiture with a crop sensor camera is going to be the 50 millimeter Canon lens, whether it's the 1.8, 1.4, or 1.2. But based upon the fact that we're starting with a low budget, I'm really going to start this series with the 1.8. And I've ordered it. It hasn't arrived yet. I'm getting it from Canon's refurbished, and I'm supposed to have it here Monday. So in a week from now, I have a photo shoot scheduled where we are going to put that lens, and probably this lens as well, the 1.4, through its paces and to see what the images look like. So this is a prime lens, meaning it's only got one focal length. It's not a zoom that gives you many options of different focal lengths. The nice thing with this lens is that it has a wide aperture. So I can be able to open this lens all the way up and be able to get in more light. So if I'm in a low exposure situation and I need to be able to keep my speed up above that 1/125th of a second, I'm able to open up the lens and allow more light in to get a correct exposure. However, if I was using a kit lens like the one on this Canon 70D, this one is an 18-135. And if I were to set it at 50 millimeter focal length, it says that my aperture would be 5.0, so it'd be a f5. So it's going to be narrowed down. I'm not going to be able to get in as much light because of that. And so therefore, I'm going to be forced to drop my speed. And if I drop my speed, I run the risk of having my photos not be focused, not be sharp. So that's kind of one of the nice things of using a prime lens or a lens with a fast lens that has a large aperture. Now, some of you may be saying, well, why don't you just raise your ISO and that way you can be able to keep your speed up? Well, the problem with doing that is when you raise the ISO, yes, the exposure levels get raised up as well, but you introduce noise into your image. So it's kind of a dance as far as ISO, speed, and aperture to try to achieve the best look in your image. And typically, I always try to keep the ISO at its lowest point, whether it's 100 or 200 ISO. I'm always trying to keep it down to that base ISO. There are situations, though, that you are forced to raise your ISO, that you have your aperture open at its max, and your speed is as low as you can go that you can safely get a sharp image. And you have no choice but to raise that ISO. But that is the last resort. That is the last thing I want to touch before everything else. Now, the last thing I want to discuss is your speed in relationship to your subject. Is your subject moving or is your subject standing still? If you're in a situation and you're taking photos of a family and they're all just posing all together, then you are able to keep your speed down close to your minimum speed. However, if you're in a situation where your family is moving, they're walking towards you, there's kids that are running around, and you want to be able to freeze that image, you're going to have to raise your speed up. You might have to use 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second, depending on how fast everything's moving. So it's kind of like you're going to be learning on the curve to be able to get those images focused correctly. And that's something to keep in mind depending on how you are shooting your situation. Most time in family photography, it's all posed. So you're not really going to run into a situation. But I have shot weddings where the bride and groom, they're walking down the aisle and everybody's standing up, clapping, reaching out, hugging, and there's a lot of movement. So you have to keep that speed up beyond your minimum speed to be able to make sure that those images are sharp. With that being said, this video really is my baseline as far as where I set my speed when I'm doing portrait photography. Yours might be different. This video is just a guideline to be able to help you be able to experiment. You're going to have to go out and you're going to have to take out friends or families and experiment. What is your baseline speed? Take this information, make it work for you, and have fun doing it. So thank you for watching. And like I said, I'm going to make another video in regards to where I'm doing a live shoot. We're going to cover this again and the relationship with aperture, ISO, and a comparison of the 50mm lenses that Canon makes. Thanks again for watching, and like always, happy shooting.